means that you and I are about to begin another round of Discovery CSI, first with this segment here on YouTube and Periscope and the various platforms that we're on, and then later we'll be continuing the conversation on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and also patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Now, David, I know you and I have had a lot of conversations about Patreon and some of the issues that have come up with the banning of Carl Benjamin. We've spoken on this channel before about how David Sweigert has been persistently harassing Patreon's legal department with daily letters, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 a day. His accusations are not even based in, let's set aside fact for a moment, they're not even consistent with what you or I have said, but he's hammering them, and the possibility exists that he may irritate them to the point of terminating this show. That's certainly his intention. To avoid that, I've created a new channel on subscribestar.com. I hope that you'll consider doing the same. But now, if anyone doesn't like Patreon, or if for some reason the show doesn't appear on Patreon, people can also go to subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. We've got a lot of important things to talk about today. How are you feeling, David?
Yeah, pretty good. And perhaps I could pick up from this wonderful collage that you put at the beginning of the show with Mr. Sweigert in the foreground with some keys around his belt and a little Entrust label over his breast pocket. Would that be a good place to start?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what happened during the 9/11 attack? A continuity of government exercise scripted by some very powerful people got switched from a simulation to a live fire attack, where I would guess the great majority of people engaged in the simulation were taken aback and would have probably been absolutely horrified at what went on. But once it had been switched, a lot of them, unfortunately, were compromised because the equipment that they'd been using, and I'm thinking specifically of patented devices, including Entrust public key infrastructure, in which Mr. Sweigert is supposedly an expert, would have been rented to the war game, and then people who had been assigned those patents, I guess, would have been given a check as a thank you very much for the use of those patents. However, what that would mean is the custodians of the patents would be liable for wrongful deaths associated with their negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use. And let me give you one example. For example, the Lockheed Martin rocket-boosted hardened penetrator that appears to have punched a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon, and maybe with sympathetic explosives in the inside the building, killed Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer, and 125 of his colleagues, for whom there has been no autopsy. That is to say, we don't know how they died, and we can't exclude the possibility that some of the people responsible for the upgrade to the Pentagon sent in a SWAT team with a Glock and punched a couple of bullets into the back of DeConto's head, and then killed 125 of his colleagues as collateral to mask a very targeted enemy, at least as far as the bad guys are concerned. So I come back to this guy, David Sweigert, and I believe he's actually, in his wisdom, I don't think he's part of their A team, but then I'm not sure they've got an A team. He actually, if I understand correctly, wrote to Serco Inc. in Washington or DC and claimed that you and I were tortiously interfering with the Serco Inc. shareholders. Which means, of course, he's not doing his homework, because Serco Inc. doesn't have any shareholders, because it's wholly owned by the Serco Group in the United Kingdom. And those shareholders, interestingly enough, on 9/11, were meeting on the 47th floor of the North Tower, and we'll come to that in a minute. So I get the impression David Sweigert is trying to alert potentially some of his clients, because he sells himself, and he's written the book, although I suppose there are several books, on ethical hacking.
Right.
which for me begs the question, on whose ethics is he working? And of course, there's a moral hazard there. And there's also another hazard, which is reliability and resilience, because let's say he's not a very smart ethical hacker and he leaves the door open into the evil bat cave, right? Which is what you show on your marvelous collage. So he might be a very ethical guy, even if he's somewhat limited in intelligence. But if he left the door open on the evil bat cave, of course, people could come in behind him, and then they would have access to the virtual reality theater of the evil bat cave, which was invented at the University of Illinois, Chicago in 1992, and link the evil bat cave to the Federal Bridge through the state of Illinois, Veterans Affairs, or the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
And of course, then the Federal Bridge, you now have 4 of the most powerful defense contractors in the world to engage their assets or hijack their assets or borrow their assets or rent their patented devices for the exercise, the continuity of government exercise. So over on the right, you've got the Boeing Company, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and these are members of the Federal Bridge. Now, over on the left-hand side of the Federal Bridge, down the bottom, you've got some other very interesting players. Just there. You've got the root authority for the Federal Bridge, meaning that any one of these people with root authority attached to their name can take over the Federal Bridge and pretend to be anyone that they want in communication secretly or covertly with anyone else on the Federal Bridge. And this, I think, this is disingenuous, and I hope not to challenge Mr. Sweigert with long words, but disingenuous. This is a pretended simplicity when he says this can't possibly be used for a man-in-the-middle attack. My dear Mr. Sweigert, it's designed for a man-in-the-middle attack, and it's not only designed for a man-in-the-middle attack, it's been designed by the British who invented it. In the late 60s and 70s, the British invented public key infrastructure and packet switching, right, which allowed them to take the continuity of government logic from World War II, when they were afraid that the Germans were going to invade, and extend it initially over the all red line and later on the Federal Bridge, so that if there was any attack or a simulated attack on the United States or the United Kingdom, then the functions of government could be delegated to other parties out of reach of the incoming enemy. So I like to ask Americans, and perhaps Mr. Sweigert has an answer to that, when this continuity of government exercise was, let's say, hacked on 9/11, and the simulation switched to live fire, and something took out the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center and killed Captain Gerald DeConto and 125 of his colleagues, what happened to the functions of the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, which had now been turned into a plasma or obliterated? So if you are a successful ethical hacker, you should have the answer to that. Now, if you don't have the answer to that, are we going to dismiss you as incompetent? Or are we going to suggest that you perhaps have loyalties to the wrong team? Either way, Mr. Sweigert, I think now we're in a position to argue that when the relatives of the 125 people in the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center understand what was done, I believe that they can bring a class action suit for damages relating to the wrongful death as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices in the custody of the defendants. So I believe that we are now in a position, that is Jason and myself and potentially the class action plaintiffs for the murders, mass murder in the Pentagon on 9/11, we're in a position to develop a class action suit concept in the court of public opinion, which is on Jason Goodman's show. And we would, I think, be looking at 3 categories of co-defendants. Now, we're talking about a great deal of money there, so maybe he should stop poking the bear, because if he upsets us, well, it's got nothing to do with whether we're upset or not, Jason. It's really, did he have custody, even if it was ad hoc or de facto custody, of some of the encryption devices on the public key infrastructure of the Federal Bridge as taken out by Entrust? So I did a little homework on the Entrust public key infrastructure patents, and lo and behold, I found out there's a mechanism for revoking certificates, let's say right in the middle of a continuity of government exercise. So the blue team defenders could have been stood down through the evil Batcave over the Federal Bridge so that they were unable to defend prime strategic targets in the United States, such as the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. So let's talk about what happened to Captain Gerald DeConto, or what appears to have happened, on the morning of 9/11. He's the duty officer of the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center during an exercise, I think it's called Global Guardian, Vigilant Guardian.
And I incorrectly had shown Amalgam Virgo. I apologize.
Yeah, that was the rehearsal on the 1st and 2nd of June, where I think Mr. Sweigert, acting in his role of ethical hacker, may have inadvertently or maliciously found out what the vulnerabilities of the defenses of the United States were during a simulated exercise and passed them on to the people who executed the red team attack on 9/11. Or, because he's negligent and incompetent, he left the door open into the Federal Bridge so people coming in behind them could actually hijack those aircraft and take out the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center. So he must roll up to work. I don't know what time he was starting, but he's duty officer. There's 125 people in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center in Wedge 1. But there's also some really sinister characters that the American public should know about, and in particular the relatives of the people who died, because the Pentagon was undergoing an upgrade project. And there's a variety of players engaged in that upgrade, right? One of them is Lockheed Martin, that was engaged, I think, in the command control, computers, communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance for the upgrade. And then there's an outfit called Base One Technologies. And Base One Technologies is a protege of Serco. So Base One Technologies, woman-owned, right? And of course, that matters because of the evil influence of DOJ pride in all matters relating to justice in the United States. But Base One Technologies specializes, amongst other things, in identifying vulnerabilities in a client's networking systems. But that's the kind of thing that I believe Mr. Sweigert specializes in. So one of the questions we should ask Mr. Sweigert is, was he aware that Base One Technologies, a protege of Serco, was engaged in vulnerability testing on the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11? And did he help them or did he hinder them? Like, who found the vulnerabilities first, Mr. Sweigert or Base One Technologies? And what did they do with the knowledge about those vulnerabilities? Did they report them to Serco? Did they report them to Captain Gerald DeConto? Did they report them to the people who had overall authority over the war game through Global Guardian? I think he has some questions. But basically, I think instead of him asking us questions, right, it's time for the people of the United States, in particular the families of the victims of 9/11 in the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, they should be asking him for an explanation or a description of what patents he might have been using for his ethical hacking. The next category of potential defendants, I think, in a class action lawsuit by the families of the people who died in the Pentagon, it would be, I think, the Serco shareholders. Now, why would Serco shareholders be an interesting class of patents? Well, one of the Serco shareholders is the British government. Another is the Saudi Arabian government. And if I understand correctly, the propaganda that we're being dealt with, a whole bunch of people, including the muscle hijackers from Al Qasim province in Saudi Arabia, came through Dubai to get their visas to get into the country. And the visas would have been issued by the people to whom an outsourcing contract, an unforgivable and treasonous, illegitimate, provided through the Clinton administration to operate the national visa for the United States of America. And that outsourcing contract went, Mr. Sweigert, to Serco in the United Kingdom. So who are you defending? Shouldn't you be asking Serco, if that was the case, well, I provided you with some vulnerability testing and ethical hacking information. Did you shut the door on the 911 attack? You were actually meeting the Serco shareholders Tower on the morning of 911 with 10 of your shareholders representing Indians with over $100 trillion of assets under management. What were you doing, Mr. Sweigert? Were you giving them information that would allow them to switch a simulated war game exercise to a live fire attack? Because if you were, either negligently, recklessly, willfully, or fraudulently, I would say, and I'm not a lawyer, right? I believe you call me Mr. Hawkins. What a high grade intelligence you have. Should I call you Mr. Sweigert? I mean, this is kindergarten stuff. But you, Mr. Sweigert, are playing with death, right? Because what happened with Serco in the Pentagon upgrade, they could have used Base 1 technologies as a hit team and provided the Base 1 people with a Glock to make sure that the high-value target, which is Captain Gerald DeConto, could not appear in court as an expert witness. Now, the MO, Jason, of these people, stop me if I rattle on too much, but
No.
you know, I'm underway, right? So what these people like to do is in the evil bat cave, I believe, they spot the high-value target that at all costs must be killed. So in that bat cave maquette or collage that you got, you can see Captain Gerald DeConto with his Navy hat, and behind him you can just make out the back or the side of the Pentagon. Behind his head there would be 4 or 5 frames recorded from a camera by that parking device, that, you know, where the bar comes up and down.
Yeah.
Which shows, they all show, interestingly enough, the date of September the 12th, 2001, and the time of 17:37:19. Well, as we know, in Washington, it was September the 11th, 2001, and it was 9:37:19. And what you've got there, I believe, is a demonstration that the camera was taking pictures from or for various people on the Federal Bridge, depending on where they were. So you have Bill Clinton, former president of the United States, and I believe a traitor, was in the Port Douglas Sheraton Hotel in Queensland, where it was September the 12th, 2001. 17:37:19 corresponds to the time in Dubai, where I used to live, where it would appear that 14 muscle hijackers coming from Al Qasim province in Saudi Arabia checked in to some agents of Serco to get their visas to come into the United States as sleeper cells for Al Qaeda. So that's one category of co-defendants, I believe, that should be brought to account in a class action suit for damages. That is Serco shareholders, which include 10 global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management, and 3 sovereign states, or 3 sovereign governments, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Singapore, and then 2 very important pension funds that I believe the members would identify with themselves as members of an intellectual elite. The American Pension Fund, which would pay pensions at various stages during or after the careers of Barack and Michelle Obama, and Hillary and Bill Clinton, they have $1 trillion of assets under management. Oh yeah, I've just noticed on Obamacare. Serco got the contract for the back office of Obamacare, meaning it now has files, I sometimes call them catalogs, on every American that might participate in that Affordable Care Act, to the extent, I believe the computers can estimate, the future expense of keeping those Americans alive. But remember, Jason, this is a very interesting ideology associated with these people of depopulation and saving carbon, right? Because what they see, and I believe these people see, one of the greatest threats to the survival of the planet is women having babies. Because from having one human being that's exhaling carbon dioxide at 40,000 parts per million, suddenly with the baby, you have two human beings. So that doubles the amount of course, the amount of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. And these clowns believe that the carbon dioxide being released by atmosphere is responsible for catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. So you really have a very sinister ideology, if you will, that is committed to killing people and selling the carbon credits or the amount of carbon saved by killing them. So then let's move on to the third category of co-defendants in any class action suit, and this is my personal belief. We have David Sweigert representing the ethical hacker community. We have Serco's shareholders representing some sovereign governments, some teachers' elites or intellectual elites, and 10 global custodians. Now, what if those 10 global custodians were represented by a law firm, because the law firm was the general counsel for the Association of Global Custodians, which was formed in 1996. Well, that company or that law firm turns out to be Baker McKenzie. And Baker McKenzie is a very interesting law firm, because it seems to have structured its affairs as what they call a Swiss verein, V-E-R-E-I-N. What is a Swiss verein? Well, it's one mechanism where you try to insulate your partners in one country from malfeasance by a partner in another. I believe there's a concept, I don't remember the Latin, fraud vitiates all. That is to say, no contract or no agreement in which there is an element of fraud is legal and upholdable. So I believe Baker McKenzie will be proved to have structured itself as a Swiss verein fraudulently to avoid that the partner in one country, let's say, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, should be held liable for the malfeasance of another partner, let's say, in the Chicago head office, presumably just around the corner from the evil Batcave inhabited as a virtual identity by the Dave Sweigerts of the world.
Wow.
So this is, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I just typed in Swiss verein and I got the McCabe law firm, IP Ethics. I'm sure it's a coincidence, but of course, Andrew McCabe is the very corrupt former deputy director of the FBI. I don't have any indication that he's affiliated with this, but I do want to sort of speak about a few caveats, David. I think we should remind viewers that you and I did not dub this bat cave at the University of Chicago as a bat cave or as evil. And it's also not the word evil, it's EVL, the Electronic Visualization Laboratory. And I guess they thought it would be, I think in British you'd call this cheeky. But it's interesting that when you Google EVL Batcave, you're getting our videos. So that's interesting. I guess those are the video search returns. But of course, the first thing that shows up is the EVL Batcave. It's a virtual reality theater, a simulation environment. And we're just, sort of talking about things that could have happened. We haven't accused anyone of anything. We're just, Mr. Sweigert tells us he's an ethical hacker. He tells us he's an expert in simulations. He's a military veteran. He's contracting to all these various organizations, and we're merely asking the question. And he might not even know the answer. It's possible that he is hired legitimately as an ethical hacker to test a system, resilience testing you've told us about. That's a legitimate exercise. What if someone is deceiving him? Hire him for a resilience testing exercise, and then when he's penetrated the security of whatever the computer system is, someone else can go in there. Cody Snodgrass has told us about umbrella operations, where there's an operation in place that covers the real operation, and the two separate operations are completely unaware of one another. So we haven't actually accused David Sweigert of anything. We're just asking, are these possibilities? I think that's a reasonable line of questioning, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why it's so important to distinguish between any attempt to nail the criminals who were obviously behind in front of a jury to convict on a basis of beyond reasonable doubt that they might be associated with a murder for hire network. And I think the remedies for the relatives, the people who died, both in Washington and New York, they have to come back a couple of stops and look at the remedy associated with a wrongful death lawsuit. I keep using to my Patreon supporters the analogy of the Erin Brockovich case, right, where this woman very courageously organized, as I understand it, town hall meetings around the 1993-1994 period at a town called Hinckley in California, based on contamination of the water supplies by PG&E. And she was able eventually to get a law firm to pick up the case with a 30% contingency. And I believe it was the largest for the time settlement in a class action lawsuit of around $330 million by PG&E, and they settled it out of court, obviously because PG&E didn't want to go through the court and get hauled into presumably something serious, or maybe even a bigger crime, a bigger malfeasance. So my understanding is, and let's get this clear, the law firm collected $130 million. Erin Brockovich collected $1.5 million, and the injured community collected $200 million. Now, if people think that that technique of going after a corporation has gone away, they should understand that the California fires, a number of them have been attributed to PG&E, and I believe PG&E risks being forced into bankruptcy. But one of the backstops for PG&E in terms of finance, and it would of course be taxpayer finance, is the state of California, which happens to be a Serco shareholder.
The state of California is a Serco shareholder.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So what I'm saying is there's no reason for, in this modern day and age, for us, that's you and I, to try and attempt to put together town hall meetings, when the beauty of the internet is you have a radio show where, as we say, we go through the evidence, or we can go through the evidence, and help people, and I'm thinking of the relatives of the people who died in the Pentagon and in the North Tower and the South Tower, understand the logic of a class action suit for wrongful deaths associated with the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices in the custody of ad hoc people, such as potentially David Sweigert, or the custodians of the companies to whom or to which the patents have been attributed. And of course, that organization of global custodians, represented by Baker McKenzie, has around $150 trillion of assets under management. And effectively, if you add up the total number of shares in Boeing owned by each of the 12 global custodians, you'll find that the global custodians and their senior counsel or their legal counsel, which is Baker McKenzie, has majority control of every major corporation in the United States of America. And it is absolute folly to outsource the selection or the administration or the processing of those patents to the British company Serco, because now what Serco has got, it controls your National Visa Center. I'm talking to you Americans. Your National Visa Center since 1994, the Defense Ammunition Center, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the Defense Red Switch Network, FAA contractor. So since the Clinton administration came in 1993, Bill Clinton and I believe his wife have handed off key controls to the United States government functions to a British company that, as far as I understand, is still under investigation for fraud in its prisoner escort service. Now, what is the prisoner escort service of Serco's? Well, what is claimed is that they were charging the taxpayer for the delivering of prisoners to court or immigration centers or returns back to the country they came from, where the prisoners were either dead, back in jail, overseas, or had never been in prison. So this was a massive fraud. The City of London police looked at Serco and said, well, we don't find any evidence that the senior directors of Serco, the people, incidentally, that Dave Sweigert is writing to, knew of this fraud. But they don't say Serco wasn't engaged in the fraud. The problem over in the United States, of course, is that model of transporting prisoners, and while they're being transported, they can form into Con Air SWAT teams and take out high-value targets or trigger mass casualty events, appears to have been transferred to Field McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy, in America, because she launched the JPAT system or JPAT service in 1984. So we got this extraordinary matrix. The RCMP call it a virtual floating matrix of organized crime. Embedded in it is unconsciously, unwittingly, or disingenuously, any word you like, Mr. David Sweigert, because he's an expert in hacking, ethical hacking and simulation. Right? You have the shareholders of Serco, including 10 global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management, meeting on the 47th floor. And then you have the council for the Association of Global Custodians, which is Baker McKenzie, that would be in a position, for example, to represent the global custodians on the 47th floor of the North Tower. So maybe there were far fewer shareholders in Serco. Maybe there was their counsel, Baker McKenzie, and then possibly Serco's investment banker, one Wilbur Ross. So sorry, I've been rattling on a bit, and I hope I'm not losing.
It's okay, David. We actually were in a really good groove there. I had the right images preloaded, and I was able to get to what you were talking about quite quickly. We're almost at the point where we're going to make the transition over to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards. And of course, the show is always simulcast on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I do want people to take a look at subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. And David, perhaps we'll start a Subscribestar page for you as well, because I want us to be having as much redundancy as we can for a variety of different reasons. And forgive me, David, I forgot to mention your new website, which is reverse-CSIscripts.com. And you've really done a great job with the design here. The homepage features this beautiful image of the All Red Line, which is the undersea cable that was first constructed, was it 1858?
Correct. The first cable across the Atlantic was laid between Ireland and Newfoundland, and subsequently, certainly by World War I, the British Empire had interconnections that made it almost totally resilient for any one cable to be cut. I think the Germans had one to South America, and the Royal Navy cut it. So Germany was isolated in World War I, and actually in many ways, I think we'll find It was isolated in World War II. It just didn't know it. Over to you.
Wow. David, before we transition over to the Patreon show, I do have a question that's sort of fundamental to everything that we've been talking about since you and I have met. I think I've developed a pretty good understanding of what the federal bridge is in terms of the descriptions you've given and how it could be hacked by someone. I'm certainly of the belief that any digital system is created by humans. It could be infiltrated by some other humans. What is the need to actually pay these patent holders? I mean, conceivably, if the USPTO is on the federal bridge and someone with root access like Entrust can penetrate the federal bridge, couldn't they just access anything in the Patent and Trademark Office without having to pay the patent owners?
Well, that's a brilliant question, Jason. And you think the issue is, you see, these people, they want to compromise the patentee, right? So I say that Christine Marcy started what I call a Con Air murder for hire patent for rent service in 1984 in the Department of Justice for the DOJ Pride organization. I also believe that it will never be possible in the present situation, with the Justice Department so badly compromised, to bring a murder for hire against Christine Marcy and her colleagues in the Department of Justice. So what they want to do is compromise people so there are no whistleblowers. So just imagine Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon are given a government contract with the understanding that 10% of the value of the contract is set aside for supposedly disadvantaged owners of small businesses, disadvantaged on the grounds of ethnicity, sexual orientation, color, or whatever kind of minority has the sympathy of the weak vote, right? So now Boeing is compromised because as it goes into the exercise, the continuity of government exercise, which let's say is trying to simulate some kind of attempt to overthrow the government on 9/11 by force, it's now compromised because it has protege companies where their first loyalty is not necessarily to the United States or to Boeing as mentor. So when these people adopt a patent, which of course they can do digitally through the patent office if there's a back door, what they want to do is say to Boeing, we're going to rent your patent, right, for the duration of this exercise. Subsequently, the patent is used to switch from a simulation to a live fire, and people die. Now the check is in Boeing's hands, or maybe one of the directors of Boeing, which might be John Shalikashvili, who with, I believe, with Clinton, treasonously betrayed the United States, because in 1997, Shalikashvili went to China and gave the details of all America's weapons programs to the People's Liberation Army generals in the university in Beijing. So the answer to your question, I think, is by compromising the people by paying them money, they are now not going to blow the whistle that they might ordinarily do it and say, well, you know, we were in the middle of an exercise and our subcontractor or our protege company suddenly switched from simulation to live fire, right? So now Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman, all four of those companies had assets engaged in the continuity of government exercise. All four of them suddenly encountered a problem when the simulation exercise got switched to live fire, and their assets like Raytheon A3 Sky Warrior or the Boeing aircraft that flew over the Pentagon have been used, and they've got money in the bank account. Over to you, Jason.
Right. Well, David, we're going to continue this conversation right just in about 20 minutes over on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I really encourage our viewers who are watching on Crowdsource the Truth to visit David's page here on Patreon and support David. David, it's a fascinating process, and as I said many times in the past, I feel like every time you and I do another show, I'm gaining a better understanding of what it is you're explaining to us, and perhaps Mr. Sweigert and some of his colleagues need to pay a little closer attention, because they don't seem to be even properly understanding what it is you're saying, and they are recklessly, negligently, or fraudulently sending letters all over the place that, frankly, I think are going to blow up in their face. Because I'm happy to speak to any of the people in any of these companies, and people who are watching us on Patreon but would like an alternative can also go to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, so wonderful to be with you here on all these public channels, and I hope that people will join us in just a few minutes when we switch over to Patreon.
Thank you, Jason. Look forward to it.